Sarah Matthews had always been different from the other settlers in Fort Davis. While most women her age spent their days tending to household duties and gossiping about neighboring families, Sarah found herself drawn to the vast Texas plains that stretched endlessly beyond the wooden walls of their small settlement. Her fascination with the land and its original inhabitants had earned her more than a few disapproving glances from the other colonists. The year was 1867, and tensions between the white settlers and the Comanche tribes ran higher than the summer heat that scorched the desert landscape. Most folks in Fort Davis spoke of the Comanche with fear and hatred, sharing stories of raids and conflicts that had shaped their understanding of these native people. But Sarah had always questioned these one-sided tales, wondering about the other perspective that nobody seemed willing to consider. Her curiosity began 3 months earlier when she discovered a wounded Comanche warrior near the creek that ran about 2 miles from the fort. Instead of running back to alert the men as any sensible woman would have done, Sarah found herself approaching the injured man with water and strips of cloth torn from her own dress. The warrior, though clearly in pain from a bullet wound in his shoulder, watched her with keen, dark eyes that held no malice, only wariness and surprise. That first encounter lasted only minutes. Sarah cleaned his wound as best she could, left water and some bread beside him, and hurried back to the settlement before anyone noticed her absence. She told herself it was simply Christian charity, nothing more. But something about the dignity in his bearing and the intelligence in his gaze had stirred something in her heart that she couldn't easily dismiss. The warrior was gone by the next day, but he had left behind a small carved wooden horse, no bigger than her palm, placed carefully where she had knelt beside him. Sarah kept the carving hidden in her room, taking it out sometimes in the evening light to admire the intricate details that spoke of skilled hands and an artistic soul. 2 weeks later, she found a bundle of prairie flowers tied with grass waiting for her at the same spot by the creek. No one else from the fort ever ventured to this particular bend in the water, and Sarah knew without doubt who had left them. Her heart raced as she looked around the empty landscape, wondering if he was watching her even then. These small exchanges continued throughout the summer. Sometimes she would find interesting stones arranged in patterns or useful herbs that she recognized from her mother's old medicine book. In return, she began leaving small offerings of her own, strips of jerky, needles and thread, once even a small mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. Sarah never saw him during these months of silent communication, but she felt his presence like a warm current running beneath the surface of her daily life. She found herself thinking about him while she worked, wondering about his life, his family, his dreams and fears. The other settlers' harsh words about his people began to sound hollow and cruel to her ears. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon in late August. Sarah had ventured further from the fort than usual, following the creek to where it pooled into a small swimming hole surrounded by cottonwood trees. She had stripped down to her undergarments and was cooling herself in the water when she heard the soft whicker of a horse. Her heart stopped as she turned to see him standing at the edge of the trees, leading a painted pony by a simple rope halter. He was exactly as she remembered. Tall and lean, with long black hair that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. But this time, instead of the wariness she had seen in his wounded state, his expression held something gentler. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small distance that separated them. Sarah felt she should be afraid, should cover herself and flee back to the safety of the settlement. Instead, she found herself wading slowly toward the bank, her eyes never leaving his face. He said something in his own language, his voice low and musical. Though she didn't understand the words, the tone was clearly questioning. Sarah realized he was asking if she was the one who had been leaving gifts, the one who had helped him when he was wounded. She nodded, suddenly feeling shy but not wanting to break this fragile connection they had built through months of silent exchanges. He smiled then, and the transformation of his features took her breath away. This was not the savage warrior that the folks at Fort Davis described in their fearful whispers. This was a man with kindness in his eyes and humor in the lines around his mouth. Over the following weeks, these meetings by the creek became regular occurrences. He taught her words in Comanche while she shared English phrases with him. His name, she learned, was Running Wolf, and he was not just any warrior, but the son of a respected chief. He told her about his people's way of life, their deep connection to the land, and their struggle to maintain their freedom as more and more settlers arrived in their territory. Sarah shared her own story, how she had come to Texas with her family after losing their farm in Missouri, how she felt trapped by the expectations placed on unmarried women in their small community, and how she had always felt more at home under the open sky than within the confines of wooden walls. Their friendship deepened with each meeting, though Sarah was careful to keep these encounters secret. She knew that discovery would mean disaster not just for herself, but potentially for Running Wolf and his band as well. The settlers would see any relationship with a Comanche as treachery, while his people might view his association with a white woman as weakness or betrayal. As autumn approached, Sarah realized that her feelings had grown far beyond friendship. She found herself counting the hours between their meetings, dreaming of his face and feeling a lightness in her chest whenever she thought of him. The intensity of these emotions both thrilled and terrified her. Running Wolf seemed to be experiencing something similar. Their conversations had become more personal, their comfortable silences more meaningful. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression that made her pulse quicken, and she wondered if he could see the same longing in her own eyes. The crisis came in early October, when word reached Fort Davis that a band of Comanche had raided a ranch 30 miles to the south. 3 men had been killed and several horses stolen. The settlement buzzed with anger and fear, and talk turned to organizing a punitive expedition to track down the responsible parties. Sarah's heart ached as she listened to the violent plans being discussed. She knew that Running Wolf's band had not been involved in the raid. He had been with her that very afternoon, sharing stories about his childhood and teaching her to identify different bird calls. But she also knew that to the settlers, one Comanche was much the same as another. When she met Running Wolf 2 days later, she found him unusually somber. He had heard about the settlers' plans through his own sources, and he knew that his band would need to move deeper into Comanche territory to avoid the coming conflict. This meeting might be one of their last. The knowledge that their time together was ending gave their conversation an urgency it had never held before. They spoke of many things that afternoon: their hopes for a future where their two peoples might live in peace, their memories of the summer they had shared, their fears about what lay ahead. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Sarah found herself faced with a moment that would define the rest of her life. The words that had been building in her heart for weeks finally demanded to be spoken. She could not let Running Wolf ride away without knowing how she felt, regardless of the impossibility of their situation. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face him fully. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch his arm, feeling the warm strength of him beneath her fingertips. In simple words that came from the deepest part of her soul, she told him that she loved him. She spoke of how he had changed her understanding of the world, how his presence had brought joy and meaning to her days, and how the thought of never seeing him again filled her with a grief she had never imagined possible. Running Wolf listened to her confession without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished speaking, he remained perfectly still, as if her words had turned him to stone. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle sound of the creek flowing nearby and the distant call of a meadowlark. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for his response, hoping desperately for some sign that her feelings were returned. But Running Wolf said nothing. His expression had become unreadable, showing neither rejection nor acceptance, neither surprise nor understanding. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped away from her touch and walked to where his horse waited patiently under the trees. Without a word or a backward glance, he swung himself onto the animal's back with the fluid grace that marked him as one who had grown up in the saddle. Sarah stood frozen by the creek, watching as the man she loved prepared to ride out of her life forever. Her confession hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire, and she wondered if she had just destroyed the most precious thing she had ever known. The sound of Running Wolf's horse disappearing into the gathering dusk left Sarah standing alone by the creek, her heart shattered into pieces as small as the pebbles beneath her feet. She remained there long after the hoofbeats had faded, staring at the path he had taken and replaying every moment of their final encounter. Had she been foolish to believe there was something special between them? Had she misread the gentle looks, the meaningful conversations, the careful gifts they had exchanged? 3 days passed without any word from Running Wolf, and Sarah moved through her daily routines like a woman walking in her sleep. She helped her mother with the cooking, mended clothes that needed repair, and participated in the women's sewing circle, all while her thoughts remained fixed on that terrible moment of silence by the creek. The other women noticed her distraction but attributed it to the general tension that had settled over Fort Davis since news of the raid. On the 4th day, Sarah's world shifted once again. She was hanging laundry behind her family's cabin when she noticed a small disturbance in the clothesline, a tiny piece of bark tucked between 2 of her father's shirts. Her heart leaped as she recognized Running Wolf's method of leaving messages. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the bark to reveal symbols drawn in charcoal: a wolf, a running horse, and what looked like a map showing a location further upstream from their usual meeting place. That afternoon, Sarah told her mother she was going to gather late-season berries and set off toward the creek with a basket and a racing pulse. She followed the landmarks indicated in Running Wolf's message, walking nearly an hour upstream to where the creek curved around a large outcropping of red rock. There, in a sheltered grove of oak trees, she found him waiting. Running Wolf looked different than she had ever seen him. Gone was the relaxed demeanor of their previous meetings. He sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man preparing for battle, his face painted with red and black designs that marked him as a Comanche warrior. When she approached, he dismounted but kept his distance, his expression serious and unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah felt the weight of her unanswered confession hanging between them like a wall made of thorns. Finally, Running Wolf broke the silence. Speaking in careful English words he had learned during their summer together, he told her that her words by the creek had struck his heart like lightning strikes a tree, leaving him changed but uncertain whether he would survive the transformation. He explained that among his people, love between a man and woman was not merely a joining of hearts, but a sacred bond that connected two souls across all the worlds, both seen and unseen. Such a love could not be entered into lightly, especially when the two people came from nations that viewed each other as enemies. Sarah listened with growing hope as Running Wolf described the 3 sleepless nights he had spent wrestling with his feelings. He had ridden far out onto the plains, seeking guidance from the spirits of his ancestors and the wisdom of the land itself. He had asked the stars to show him a path that might allow their love to exist without bringing destruction upon both their peoples. The answer that came to him was both beautiful and terrible in its implications. It was a way for them to be together, but it would require sacrifices that would forever change the course of both their lives. Running Wolf's band was preparing to journey far to the north, beyond the reach of the white settlers and the soldiers who hunted them. They would join with other Comanche groups in the remote regions where the old ways could still be lived freely. If Sarah truly loved him as she claimed, Running Wolf said, she could come with them. She could leave her old life behind and become part of his people, learning their customs and contributing her skills to their survival. His mother, who was known for her wisdom and kindness, had already agreed to teach Sarah the ways of Comanche women. His father, though initially skeptical, had been impressed by stories of the white woman who had shown mercy to a wounded warrior. But Running Wolf was honest about what such a choice would mean. Sarah would have to abandon everything she had ever known: her family, her culture, her very identity as a white woman. She would be crossing a line from which there could be no return. The settlers would consider her a traitor, and she would never again be able to walk safely among her own people. Her parents would mourn her as if she had died, and her name would become a whisper of shame among the families of Fort Davis. Moreover, Running Wolf continued, the life of his people was not easy even in the best of times. They faced constant pressure from the expanding white settlements, diminishing herds of buffalo, and the ever-present threat of military campaigns designed to force them onto reservations. A woman who chose to join them would share in all these hardships, trading the relative security of settler life for the uncertain freedom of the plains. Sarah felt as if she was standing at the edge of a vast canyon, looking across an impossible distance to a life she could barely imagine. The magnitude of what Running Wolf was offering both thrilled and terrified her. This was not simply a romantic dream, but a fundamental reimagining of who she was and who she might become. She asked for time to consider his proposal, and Running Wolf agreed to meet her again in 3 days at the same location. He would bring supplies and horses if she decided to come with him, or he would say goodbye forever if she chose to remain with her people. Either way, he said, he would respect her decision and carry his love for her with honor regardless of the path she chose. Those 3 days were the longest of Sarah's life. She moved through her familiar routines while her mind raced with questions and possibilities. She studied her parents' faces across the dinner table, wondering if she would ever see them again. She looked at her small room with its simple furnishings and tried to imagine what possessions she could carry into an entirely different existence. Sarah also found herself observing the other women of Fort Davis with new eyes, noticing things that had never bothered her before, the way they accepted limitations on their movements and ambitions, the fear that governed so many of their decisions, the narrowness of their concerns and conversations. For the first time, she truly understood how different she was from them, and how unlikely it was that she would ever find contentment within the boundaries they accepted as natural and proper. On the second night, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She decided to tell her mother the truth about Running Wolf and the choice she faced. Martha Matthews was a practical woman who had survived the hardships of frontier life through determination and adaptability. If anyone might understand Sarah's situation, it would be her. The conversation took place in the kitchen after Sarah's father had gone to bed. Martha listened without interruption as her daughter described the summer of secret meetings, the growing friendship that had blossomed into love, and the impossible choice that now lay before her. When Sarah finished, Martha sat quietly for a long time, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen walls. Finally, Martha spoke. She told Sarah about her own youth, about dreams she had harbored of a different kind of life before duty and circumstance had shaped her path. She spoke of the love she had felt for Sarah's father, and how that love had been enough to sustain her through years of hardship and loss. But she also acknowledged that Sarah had always been different, possessed of a spirit that seemed too large for the conventional life that was expected of her. Martha could not advise her daughter to abandon everything for an uncertain future with a man from a hostile tribe, but neither could she tell Sarah to deny the deepest calling of her heart. Instead, she offered something more precious than advice: her understanding, and if Sarah chose to go, her blessing. The final day arrived grey and overcast, with autumn winds that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwood trees. Sarah spent the morning in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal activity, while her mind remained fixed on the approaching moment of decision. She packed carefully, choosing items that would be useful in her new life, while leaving behind anything that would weigh her down or mark her too clearly as a product of white civilization. Her grandmother's wedding ring went into her pocket, along with the small carved horse that Running Wolf had left for her months earlier. Everything else, her dresses, her books, her childhood treasures, would remain behind as artifacts of a life she was preparing to leave forever. When the time came, Sarah walked toward the creek with steady steps, but a heart that felt as if it might burst from the conflicting emotions warring within it. She was walking toward love, toward adventure, toward a freedom she had never dared to dream possible. But she was also walking away from safety, from family, from everything that had defined her existence for 22 years. Running Wolf was waiting exactly where he had promised to be. He had brought a gentle mare for her to ride and supplies for their journey north. But when he saw her approaching, something in her posture or expression must have told him that her decision was not what he had hoped. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked vulnerable and young. Sarah stopped a few feet away from him, close enough to see the hope and fear battling in his dark eyes. The words she had rehearsed during her walk to the creek suddenly seemed inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. How could she explain that her love for him was real and deep, but that she could not find the courage to step so completely outside the world she had always known? Instead of speaking immediately, Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew the carved wooden horse he had given her. She held it out to him, not as a rejection, but as a symbol of everything they had shared and everything they could not have. The small carving seemed to hold the weight of their entire impossible love story. Running Wolf stared at the carved horse in Sarah's outstretched hand. Understanding her answer without need for words, the small wooden figure seemed to bridge the impossible distance between their two worlds, while simultaneously representing everything that kept them apart. After a moment that felt like a lifetime, he gently closed her fingers around the carving, his touch warm and final. Instead of anger or disappointment, Running Wolf's expression softened with something that looked like relief mixed with profound sadness. He told Sarah that he had spent the previous night in prayer and meditation, and the spirits had prepared him for this moment. Her choice, he said, showed wisdom rather than cowardice. The path he was offering would have led to great joy, but also to great suffering for both of them. Running Wolf explained that his people were facing increasingly difficult times. The buffalo herds were shrinking, white settlements were spreading across traditional hunting grounds, and the military campaigns against the Plains tribes were becoming more frequent and more brutal. The freedom he had offered Sarah was real, but it was also fragile and might not survive much longer. By choosing to remain with her people, she was choosing a life with more certainty, even if it came with different limitations. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she listened to his words. She wanted to tell him that his understanding made the separation even more painful, but she found herself unable to speak. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, memorizing the feel of his skin and the way the afternoon light caught in his eyes. Running Wolf covered her hand with his own and told her that their love had been a gift, even if it could not be a permanent one. Through knowing her, he had learned that the hatred between their peoples was not inevitable or natural. There were individuals on both sides capable of seeing beyond fear and prejudice to the common humanity that connected all people. This knowledge would guide him in the difficult years ahead and perhaps help him find ways to bridge the divide that seemed so insurmountable now. He asked Sarah to make him a promise. Whatever life she chose to build in the years ahead, he wanted her to remember that she was capable of great courage and great love. He had seen her step outside the boundaries that confined other women of her culture, and he believed she could do so again when the time was right. Perhaps she would find ways to help her people understand the Comanche better, or perhaps she would simply live as an example that different ways of being were possible. Sarah promised, though she could barely imagine how she would honor such a commitment. At that moment, it felt like her heart was breaking into pieces that could never be put back together. How could she return to the small concerns and petty judgments of Fort Davis after experiencing the depth of connection she had found with Running Wolf? As if reading her thoughts, Running Wolf told her that love was not something that could be lost, only transformed. The feelings they shared would not disappear simply because they could not be expressed in the way they had hoped. Instead, that love would become part of who they were, influencing every choice they made and every person they encountered. In this way, their connection would continue even after they parted. Running Wolf mounted his horse and gathered the reins of the mare he had brought for Sarah. He would take both animals north with his band, he said, but he would always think of the gentle mare as Sarah's horse. Someday, when the conflicts between their peoples had ended and peace had come to the plains, perhaps their children or their children's children would meet without the barriers that now seemed so absolute. As he prepared to leave, Running Wolf made one final gesture. From a pouch at his belt, he withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was a necklace made of carved bone and colored beads, worked in the intricate patterns that Comanche women wore to mark important occasions. His mother had made it for Sarah, he explained, as a wedding gift for the white woman who had shown kindness to her son. Sarah accepted the necklace with trembling hands, knowing that she would treasure it for the rest of her life even though she could never wear it openly. The careful craftsmanship and the generous spirit behind the gift moved her deeply, representing an acceptance and welcome from Running Wolf's family that she would never be able to claim. Their final goodbye was wordless. Running Wolf touched his fingers to his heart and then extended his hand toward Sarah, a gesture that seemed to encompass everything they had shared and everything they were leaving behind. Sarah repeated the movement, feeling as if she were placing her heart in his keeping even as they prepared to walk separate paths. Then Running Wolf turned his horse north and rode away, leading the mare that had been meant for Sarah's new life. She watched until he disappeared over a low hill, taking with him the possibility of a future she would spend the rest of her life imagining. The walk back to Fort Davis felt like a journey through a landscape that had been permanently altered. Everything looked the same. The familiar buildings, the smoke rising from chimneys, the sounds of daily activity. But Sarah felt like a different person than the woman who had walked this same path just hours earlier. She carried within herself now the weight of a great love and a great sacrifice, and she knew that these experiences would color everything that came after. Sarah's mother was waiting for her when she returned home, taking one look at her daughter's face and understanding immediately what had transpired. Martha Matthews wrapped Sarah in a fierce embrace, offering the comfort of unconditional love without any need for explanations or justifications. That night, mother and daughter sat together in the kitchen, sharing a pot of tea and a silence that held more understanding than any words could have conveyed. In the months that followed, Sarah gradually found her place in a life that felt both familiar and strange. She continued to help with household duties and participate in community activities. But she also began to do things that would have seemed impossible before her encounter with Running Wolf. She started a small school for the children of Fort Davis, teaching them not only reading and arithmetic, but also lessons about treating all people with respect and kindness. Sarah also became known for her skill in treating injuries and illnesses, using knowledge she had gained from her mother's medical books combined with techniques she had learned during her secret meetings with Running Wolf. She never revealed the source of some of her most effective remedies, but she used them to help anyone who needed healing, regardless of their background or beliefs. As the years passed, Sarah never married, despite receiving several offers from respectable men in the growing community. When asked about her single status, she would simply say that she was content with her independence and her work. Only her mother understood the real reason, and Martha Matthews kept her daughter's secret until her dying day. Sarah often walked to the creek where she and Running Wolf had spent so many precious hours together. She would sit by the water and wonder about his life, hoping that he had found safety and happiness among his people. Sometimes she imagined she could hear the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, and her heart would race with the impossible hope that he might have returned for her. The carved wooden horse remained Sarah's most treasured possession, hidden in a small box with the necklace from Running Wolf's mother and a collection of other mementos from their brief time together. On quiet evenings, she would take out these objects and remember the man who had changed her understanding of love and courage. News of the Indian Wars occasionally reached Fort Davis, and Sarah would listen to reports of battles and casualties with a heavy heart. She never learned what became of Running Wolf or his band, whether they had found the freedom they sought in the Northern Territories or whether they had been caught up in the violent conflicts that marked the final decades of the 19th century. Years later, when Sarah was an elderly woman respected throughout the region for her teaching and healing work, a young Comanche man appeared at her door. He had traveled hundreds of miles, he said, carrying a message from his grandfather, a man who had once known a white woman by a creek near Fort Davis. The young man told Sarah that Running Wolf had lived a full life, becoming a respected leader among his people and working tirelessly for peace between the tribes and the white settlers. He had married a Comanche woman and raised children who carried his wisdom and strength into a new generation, but he had never forgotten the white woman who had shown him that love could exist across the boundaries of race and culture. Before his death, Running Wolf had asked his grandson to find Sarah and tell her that their love had indeed transformed into something permanent and powerful. The kindness she had shown him as a wounded warrior had planted seeds of compassion that had grown throughout his life, influencing his approach to leadership and his relationships with people from all backgrounds. In this way, their brief connection had created ripples that spread far beyond what either of them could have imagined. The young man also carried a gift, a new carving of a horse, this one made by Running Wolf's own hands during his final years. It was larger and more intricate than the first, showing a mare and foal running free across an endless plain. With it came a message that love, like the wild horses of the plains, could not be captured or tamed, but its beauty and power could be witnessed and remembered by those fortunate enough to encounter it. Sarah accepted the gift with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, understanding that this was Running Wolf's way of telling her that their story had ended not in tragedy, but in triumph. They had loved truly and completely, even if only for a brief season, and that love had made both of their lives richer and more meaningful. As the young Comanche man prepared to leave, Sarah asked him to carry her own message back to Running Wolf's family. She wanted them to know that their husband, father, and grandfather had been a man of extraordinary honor and kindness, and that knowing him had been the greatest privilege of her life. The love they had shared across the divide of culture and circumstance had taught her that the human heart was capable of connections that transcended any barrier erected by fear or prejudice. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. In her hands, she held the two carved horses, the first marking the beginning of her great love story, and the second celebrating its enduring legacy. She thought about the choices that had shaped her life and the paths not taken, and she felt a deep peace settling over her heart. Their love had been impossible in the practical sense, bounded by the conflicts and prejudices of their time, but it had also been absolutely real, creating changes in both their lives that had rippled outward to touch countless other people. In choosing to love across the divide, they had proven that such connections were possible, leaving a legacy of hope for future generations who might find ways to bridge differences that had seemed insurmountable. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude for the gift of having known Running Wolf, for the courage to love deeply despite impossible odds, and for a life that had been transformed by the brief but powerful connection between two souls who had dared to see beyond the boundaries of their separate worlds.